name is Amy Appleford again. I'm here in the English department, and I want to thank Susan. Sorry.
Yeah, just put this a little closer.
You think? Okay. Too much? Okay. And I want to just thank Susan again for and everybody involved this wonderful conference, and also ask for Susan for asking me to participate. As somebody who works on the deep past, I work on the medieval period. It's a real pleasure to be involved in this contemporary discussion. The work that I do, though, in the deep past is thinking about how narrative and scripts, cultural scripts for thinking about critical illness and dying and death. So I think a lot about how narrative works as we try to give shape to human experiences of dying, of the loss of others, or loss of life. So both as a medievalist and what I work on, but also as a literary critic, one of the things that I've found that's really fascinating about the discussion so far is the prevalence of narrative as a term of art that we've had over the last 2 days. So I just want to say something very short about that, sort of gathering up what we've heard so far about how narrative works, or how narrative might function in relationship to the opioid crisis, and then so that's going to be very brief, and then have a few questions for our panelists before opening it up to the audience. Because I think what we've heard now in this very rich panel that we just heard are some different understandings of narrative, moving it away from personal narrative. But I want to just say something about that before we move on to these new ideas. So from what I have heard listening for the last couple days, substance abuse disorder narratives are testaments. They're basically, they inform and function. They testify or bear witness to the experience of addiction or recovery. They are not only in this, because they are these testamentary in their form, they don't just describe what has happened or is happening. They also actively and proactively ask or demand something of us, the reader or spectator. The narratives of substance use disorder thus are performative. By this I don't mean that they're pretend or showy or dramatic, but rather that they are a kind of language that both describes the world and enacts something in the world. It has an effect on the world. That is, they intervene in the world. So what acts do they perform? What are their actions? How do they perform? They begin by asking us to complicate our ready-made ideas about what testimony is. In a substance use disorder narrative, testimony and bearing witness means something more complicated than the available legal meaning we conventionally give the term, that is, corroboration. I saw this and proved it happened. To reduce testimony to this legalistic definition is to miss its more profound meanings. These narratives are not only descriptions of what has happened or is happening, but actively do something. They call upon readers and spectators, summoning us to affirm the uniqueness and dignity of the other's experience. In their testamentary function, these narratives demand our non-indifference to the life, the mortal vulnerability, and possibilities of others. In this function, these narratives remind us that our lives are complexly and dynamically lives of interdependence. That is, they are lives that are quickened by complicated, irrepressible, and unending obligations and indebtedness to each other. That interdependence and those obligations to others are sometimes easy to forget because we live in a culture that, for various historical and cultural reasons, otherwise gives extraordinary prestige on becoming autonomous, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, manning up to life, being captain of one's own fate, etc. Instead, these narratives register the deep ways in which the precariousness and specificity of the other person calls for us to respond with care, respect, help, patience, imagination, and understanding. These narratives thereby make them deeply ethical in nature and in function. These narratives, and this is the point that I want to bring up, a new point, I think, so far, is that these narratives are not private memoranda written by their prospective narrators just for themselves. They are written for others. They enter into the public sphere. And it's this way in which the substance use disorder narratives complicate or put pressure on the split between the public and the private is something that I've been very interested in hearing over the past couple days. That these are intimate accounts of experience that are then put forward in the public sphere. For some people, such a narrative can prove extraordinarily useful, but for others, the danger, it seems to me, is that at the moment of greatest exhaustion, the person is being asked to take on yet another task. They have to become the articulate person bearing tidings of exemplary perseverance or vulnerability. They have to learn to tell a story about themselves where they are the protagonist. They are sympathetic, to become a sympathetic survivor, a victim, or a convert. So that's one of the things that I wanted to point out, is that when we are talking about sort of personal narratives and the way that they function in the response to the opioid crisis, there is a part of that we haven't really spoken about, is that the kind of pressure it puts on people to represent, to make their private lives public. And so that's one of the aspects of the way that we've been talking about narrative, that I think is potentially something we need to think more about, the reliance on personal narrative as a kind of structure or call to action. So that was the one thing I wanted to say. So I have some questions to start us off today for all of our speakers. I'm going to address them to specific people, specific panelists, but I think they often, anybody here could actually respond to them. The first one is actually to take us back to our first paper, Susan's paper. And it's really, again, thinking about the role of narrative and the kind of ethics of narrative in the crisis, and also the way that we think about narrative and personal responsibility in creating narrative. For one thing that I thought was really interesting is the Wallace quotes that you gave are actually really corrosive in thinking about undercutting the idea of personal narrative of having kind of efficacy. So the rehab patient, the doctor, and the counselor. Wallace is kind of turning a really corrosive kind of eye on the way that personal narrative might function in that. In addiction, in recovery. So I just wondered, that was the first thing I wanted to ask you about. And then the second one is a sort of broader thing, which we haven't really talked about. Your paper is our first paper that really asked us to think about the construction of drug use, addiction in popular culture and popular media. And so your reading of Breaking Bad is great, it's fascinating, and I think you're right. However, in terms of ethical responsibility of the producer, the makers of Breaking Bad, what is it to create an anti-hero who's a producer of drugs? And is that narrative, are we supposed to be thinking about, I think this has come up a few times, about judging narratives around the opioid crisis, and whether or not Breaking Bad or other kinds of cultural production needs to be viewed in that lens about how it contributes or, works against the crisis. Makes sense.
Okay, should I respond now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give it a whirl here. Let me, first say that your sense of I'm not sure I completely understand the term corrosive or what you mean by it. Maybe you could just specify that a little more.
Sure. If we go back to the Wallace's, because they're not exactly parodies of the description of the patient or the doctor, the speeches, but they are certainly not celebratory. So I mean, corrosive in the sense of putting pressure on the idea of the authentic recovery narrative in some way having a kind of special cultural power.
So you're another word you could, a synonym for corrosive could be irony, sarcasm to some extent. And I do think, one of the things that I think is really powerful about Wallace, and And it has struck me over the, in listening to all the panelists over the last, I guess it's been a day and an evening, is that, I think there is, we've all made an effort, I think, as people who come together to present tend to do, to be agreeable and seem as if we're all saying the same thing, or that we are complementing one another's views. And one thing I would say is I think we have very different views of narrative. And I would say that mine, probably not surprisingly, might be closest to Owen's. I heard a lot of suspiciousness about what happens to narratives, when they go out into the world, from your paper, and, a strong sense of the susceptibility of narrative to exploitation and, misappropriation. So, I do think that Wallace writes with that kind of understanding. I think there's always this sense of, I'm playing with you, I'm manipulating you because I expect you to manipulate my portrait. And I think he understands language that way too. I think it's part of the larger subversiveness of that novel. I think it's one of the things that makes it so powerful. I would say that in a way, for me, it goes back a bit to the question that that Liz Gaufberg raised about, what do we do with the language? And actually, maybe I shouldn't go on for too long. We're trying to leave room for questions. But I was just going to say that I think if there's any type of language that Wallace is writing, against, it's euphemism, and the ways in which euphemistic language are so fundamental to clinical exchange, therapeutic treatments. So he's I think corrosive is probably a good word. I wouldn't have thought of it, but I think and I think what you see there is pretty accurate. On the other hand, one of the things that I would argue about Wallace, and this is what I started to see when I was working on this paper for this event, is that I do think there's a joyousness in his vision and in his writing. And I think that joyousness has to do in part with the recognition of certain fundamental similarities that are very human. And one of these for him is a lot of these qualities. This idea that all of us believe. It's a profound insight. All of us believe that we're unique. To take that, I think one of the things that's most powerful about Wallace is he takes these kinds of insights and he shares them and stages them in the most abject places, including, places where homeless addicts are and rehab houses. And I think in those ways, what we get as a consequence is a really ennobling vision, of how to think about people who are suffering, and also how to acknowledge their humanity. So I think the corrosiveness, I guess is what I would say, just quickly in conclusion, is that the corrosiveness is in defense of, on behalf of in what is, to me, a very optimistic and even joyous, understanding of human beings. In terms of, this idea of drug use so your question is really about responsibility and what is a serial like Breaking Bad envisioning in terms of, its plea to the audience. I guess one thing I would say, and one piece of the argument that's not really much developed in the paper is what I see is the very profound traditionalism of Breaking Bad. To me, it's no accident that, the pivotal plot point is, happens in terms of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, because I think that, the really great TV serial creators are channeling a classic U.S. tradition. And my sense when I look at sort of, the field of I call it U.S. literature, just to acknowledge that Latin America exists, But when I look at, works like Huckleberry Finn or, novels by Toni Morrison or, Faulkner, I don't see much heroism. I see, in fact, a lot of really blighted lives and suffering people who are not, to be imitated, and in fact, who, foreground for all of us, real ethical problems. I mean, that, I think another great example is Lolita, a novel like, Nabokov's Lolita, where we are put in the mindset of a child molester and forced not only to acknowledge his humanity, but forced to acknowledge his incredible brilliance. So I guess what I would say is I don't see the creators of Breaking Bad doing anything different from what I see, most of the great cultural producers, in other American forms doing. And sorry if that was a little bit long-winded. You might not want to ask me any more questions.
Thanks, Susan. That's great. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, I think, I guess what's so interesting as a literary critic, listening to the discussion the last couple of days, is that I'm thrilled with the power that narrative is getting, like the attention from so many different directions, and understanding that there's a power there in narrative form. But I get uneasy because narrative can be used for various other, is not an inherently ethical phenomenon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so this is both your discussion of Breaking Bad and actually, John, your presentation. I was fascinated, John, in your description of this amazing program, which has been so successful, but has so many counterintuitive things about it. One, I'm really interested when you said that part of the core of the program, from the police perspective, is reframing addiction as a disease, not a crime. And we've heard that kind of elsewhere in the discussion, that's something that has to happen. But was that difficult with police enforcement? I mean, with law officers who sound like they're doing amazing work. But the legality issue is interesting to me, is that because heroin is still legal. So, I mean, the kind of double thinking that must have to happen for law enforcement officers to treat the people that, when they get a call, as people who need help rather than arresting. So I just wondered, it sounds like it was obviously very successful, but did you hear about any sort of growing pains about that as they kind of changed the discourse and how they were going to think about that?
Yeah, I think it was really hard for a lot of older police officers and younger ones who were uninformed to not see, drug addicts and junkies and moral failing and but as I mentioned, this epidemic's been raging for 10 years at least, and at some point for all of us, you just wonder, what are you doing? How are you spending your time? And what good are you doing? And I think so there was it was one particular chief that just said, this is, he'd been doing, he was a detective for years. He'd been making drug busts and going to apartments with, finding mothers with needles in their arms and babies in a crib and saying, how am I helping?
Yeah.
So, it's just, it was a mindset over time. And then the more awareness around reaching out to people in the recovery community who have successfully survived and thrived, what worked and didn't work. And, it was a lot of realizing that compassion and love and attention worked, and arresting and rearresting and putting people in jail and forcing them to, withdraw wasn't working.
Yeah.
And then the more our chiefs started to look into this thing, they realized this is truly, a manufactured crisis.
Right.
By largely, going back to one particular family, the Sackler family in Purdue. And before that, with OxyContin, was not nearly what it became. So, again, bad public policy, and they're on the front lines. And so they just decided it's time to do something different. And it was really disruptive. And I think it was empowering for our chiefs to have a disruptive role
Yes,
You know,
imagine.
for police of all people to say we can't arrest our way out of a public
Yeah,
health crisis.
Yeah, no, that's really, it's quite a fascinating phenomenon. Oh, thank you. Okay, so, well, that brings me up the, because one of the things that your paper uh, or presentation, and then going over to Ben's paper, because Ben, one of the things that was fascinating is that we're actually, with your paper, we get behind big pharma into this like a deeper history of opioids. The one thing that, and this is again, it connects a little bit to Susan's images, that I wondered about is the role of technology is the thing that, and how is that changing things? I mean, technology is changing our lives all over the place and communication, but there's these very organic looking processes of working with plants, and then the ability to synthesize, to create synthetic opioids, and then the kind of iconic image of Pinkman with the vial that you can actually create it in a motorhome or something. And so I just wondered about technology and how is that changing just the shape of it. Is there a break? Because you're really, I think, implicitly suggesting there's a continuity, but is there something different about the crisis now, the accessibility of synthetic opioids?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the evolution of different waves of the opioid crisis in the United States, which I would date back to the Civil War and kind of the first wave of this crisis, and then there are other longer inflection points, is absolutely conditioned by different technologies that are available, and it's very prescient to pick that up. I mentioned the hypodermic needle as this new modality that gets opium in the body much more effectively. There was a big shift that occurred among Asian users in the 19th century when eating opium, which was a practice across Asia, moved into smoking opium. That was a relatively newer modality for consumption, also in the 19th century. The technologies of production have changed tremendously. So we think about, I'll mention very quickly that process that you used to need to score poppies, and now you can use something. Actually, India still uses the scoring method, but all other countries in the world that produce, and that's primarily Turkey and Australia, they use this much more effective mode for getting alkaloids out of poppies. And I think that's one of the things that contributes to a glut of global supply.
Right, okay.
When we think about the 2010s, there's a proliferation of new technologies that we might not think about, but that are equally important, and they lurk in the background of these stories. They're very, well, they're either very sexy or unsexy technologies, depending on how you speak about them, and they look very different from the image of Jesse Pinkman in an RV, or even Walter White's nicer. Actually, they look closer to Walter White's nice lab in the basement that he gets sometime during the third or fourth season. They are things like, actually it's two in particular. Bitcoin, digital currency transfer is very important. That's something that links consumers and producers, and it's something that we've seen in the last couple of years as one of the modalities for transferring cash internationally. The other thing that's important is something that came out of supply chain management and related things. It's this agile manufacturing. It means that laboratories that are creating fentanyl, carfentanil in China, can adapt very quickly to the demands of the markets in the state. It's a very grim but very effective concordance between demand in the States tied to specific locations that are the entrepôts and the production sites, which are increasingly now in China when we think about these synthetics. So
So you don't have to wait for the crop to ripen
No,
anymore,
no.
right? So we don't have that kind of
and-
link to agriculture.
yeah,
in the same way.
and the organic cycle of poppy production is less and less important.
Yeah.
It begins tapering off in the 1980s, and I think tracing that is important. I think that had we had, and maybe this is anachronistic, but I think that had we had a different system for regulating, growing, and moving poppy from place to place, that wouldn't have obviated the needs for better semi-synthetic opioids, but I think we might have had a different story.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. That's
I
wonderful.
think it's interesting to talk about the delivery system too, because as you know, the opioid epidemic really was developed largely by the use of legally prescribed opioids, and then when that got to be when you were cut off by your doctor, and and too expensive to buy on the street, you know, there was this great opportunity for the cartels to reach the white, wealthy kids. You know, it wasn't like having to go to the bad part of town and buy heroin. It was a pizza delivery system with a phone call to a dispatch and the heroin directly to your home. And then the you know, cartels then realized, geez, we could make fentanyl and have it be even cheaper than heroin.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, so again, we've got, it's about access and there's too much product really, and access to it is too easy, because we heard that yesterday. So Paul, I'm doing my narrative all the way along. So I need to ask more about the two arrows. One of the things is that's a really ascetic kind of text. So I was really interested in, because I think implicit, I mean other people will want to talk about the figures. So they'll want to talk about those slides are you know, just boggling. But hovering over the presentation at the beginning and the end was a kind of critique of U.S. morals and culture, potentially, or pointing out a problem. And I was really interested that text is the one that used as a framing, because it really is a kind of, it actually, the proper disciple has learned indifference. And that's almost kind of counterintuitive. It's certainly not very American.
Yeah, so there's a term in Buddhism called the Brahma Viharas. So they're the four abodes of Brahma. And the Brahma Viharas are a very interesting construct because on the one part, there's things like compassion, equanimity, sympathetic joy, and a variety of other characteristics. And what the Buddhists do is they separate out for those Brahma Viharas, and this is where it's really unique. It's their near enemies and their enemies. So the opposite of compassion is hatred. The near enemy of compassion, which seems like it's like compassion, is pity. So the near enemy of equanimity is indifference. So I don't think this is really about indifference. I mean, it's really always hard to talk about Buddhism and Buddhist metapsychology and Buddhist thinking because it's kind of doesn't lend itself to words. You know, my favorite, when I was much younger and studying Zen, my favorite Zen story or Zen koan was called Man Up a Tree. And Man Up a Tree goes like this, and you struggle to answer this. I never answered it, but you have to struggle to answer the koan. And it goes like this. You're hanging from a tree by your mouth. Someone comes up to you and asks you to tell them the truth of the Buddha's Dharma or teaching. If you don't answer, you fail in your obligation. If you answer, you fall and lose your life. So I don't want to fall and lose my life by saying something. I think it's not. We think of it as indifference sometimes, you know, just like the term, for example, emptiness. People use the term, you know, there's a term in Buddhist thinking which is sunyata, or emptiness. What is empty in Buddhism is not this. This all has relative reality. What's empty in Buddhism is the idea that there is an absolute singular eternal thing which is irreducible, like the soul, for example. So in Hindu or in Sanskrit, the soul is Atman, and in Buddhism it's Anatman, without Atman. But it's not that this doesn't have reality, and indeed, the notion that if one is deeply and profoundly connected to everything else, the natural state of that is really should be more compassion and a sense of fellow feeling. I think the critique on the US side is much more around the fact that we have a pretty savage culture. You know, I mean, we, for whatever set of reasons, you know, have tolerated everything from genocide to severe racism to a level of murder on a daily basis in this country through guns. that, frankly, no other country in the world will tolerate. We have a level of income inequality now which is reaching really kind of epic proportions. And we have responded to that by, a set of, and we're, are among the world's, greatest consumers of, pharmaceuticals, particularly illegal pharmaceuticals. So, at some point, this party is going to come to an end. And we maybe are not quite there yet, but, it ain't going to go on forever. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the United States being 8 years old, growing up in New York City, and knowing that New York City was the center of the world. And while we still have the dominant economy in the world, that's not going to be true in 50 years. It's just not.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to ask folks who have questions, please. We have microphones on either side, so please, if you have questions for our panelists, please make your way and we will continue our discussion in a more dialogic way. I wondered if, while people are finding their ways, I don't know if panelists have questions for each other, because that sometimes is something that gets overlooked.
I do, actually.
Yeah, that's what I thought
I
you
mean,
might just
I was actually wondering, I was going to ask John Rosenthal about the implementation of your project in different kinds of communities. And, your map seems to show, you're everywhere. But I'm just curious, what's the difference between implementing the program in, say, urban Baltimore and, Gloucester? There's got to be some very serious differences in, I'm just curious about the kinds of issues that come up around people coming in and also, the behavior of the police too and the interrelationships.
Yeah, well, we're only 3.5 years old, so it's difficult to know how successful. When we first started, it seemed as though this was the kind of program that could only work in small communities where community policing and people know their community and their
Homogeneous.
Yeah, like Gloucester. Basically it's 4 families and they're all related in some way, and they. The police know everybody, and they used to have to apologize when they arrested, their neighbors. Whereas, Phoenix and other big cities, are quite different. But there was a sense that it couldn't work in big cities. Even, Billy Evans, the police commissioner in Boston, told me when we started, John, this is great, but, we couldn't do it in Boston because the minute we said, come into the Boston Police Department, we'd have 1,000 people. Well, it didn't happen that way. Boston did, and did join, big department. So, we have a recovery coach in each district, and we're helping take the load off of the line officers. But mainly, it's just law enforcement across the country are tired, really, really tired. And they're beginning to realize that that they need help, and it's not coming, so they're going to do it themselves, but it's not sustainable long term, and they're just basically trying. And so, it started out just in small departments. Now it's getting into big departments. I think we'll be in every state in the country. The Attorney General in the state of Pennsylvania has basically announced to all the law enforcement agencies across the state, we want you to do this. We made a presentation in Michigan, started in Macomb County. Every single police department in Macomb County joined. It's a red state now. And then it expanded to the state police. So it's being seen as a way, it's just a new way of policing, and it doesn't have so much to do with, it really has to do with breaking down the barriers of the stigma, because police were the first to admit they thought these folks were all junkies, and now it's their brothers, their sisters, their kids, their nieces, and their nephews. So, it's finally taken that long. So it's, the barriers are breaking down across all of law enforcement, big and city chiefs alone.
Interesting. Would you start us off? Would you mind just telling us who you are, just so we
Sure.
face things?
My voice is kind of gone, but My name is Cindy Liu. I'm the artist who did the sculpture that's out front. And just thank you so much, all of you. This has been really amazing. My main question is for Professor Siegel. It was really interesting to see these shifts in global supply and demand. And as you were talking about the current supply of synthetic opioids from China to the West, it kind of got me thinking about the arrow having gone in the other direction historically, in the opium wars, and that as a deliberate matter of policy, as far as, I'm not a historian, but as far as I understand, that was deliberate policy on the part of the British government. And I believe, like in China, that period is known as, after that is known as the century of humiliation, which is quite strong. Yeah. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but I guess, do you know if that has had an impact on the current supply coming to the West? I'm not saying that there's something deliberate, but I'm wondering if you know about the interplay between those historical events.
So thank you so much for that question. You could write an amazing history of global opioids through a social and political history of modern China. And I'm thrilled that you asked that question, because about a month ago, I realized that China was kind of the central role it played a central role in this narrative, starting, of course, with the Opium Wars, maybe even a little before that, during which the British were the world's largest drug dealers and built an empire around the movement of opium from Indian plains to China. The visual circulation, speaking of narratives, the visual circulation of the Chinese addict in photography was this massive trope for prohibitionists, for crusaders in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So the Chinese body politic was very important in constructions in the West for what opium looked like, what a crisis looked like, what addiction looked like. And it struck me very recently that I didn't understand, or I didn't have knowledge of how Chinese historiography and Chinese popular opinion treats the 19th century and how they've reported on the crisis. And so what I did is that in the absence of Chinese language skills myself, I hired 2 Chinese research assistants to start plumbing through that literature. So it's a question that I don't have an answer to yet, but hopefully will shortly. But you're absolutely right in that China it plays this central and very kind of circular role. It's a very kind of ambiguous role in the crisis, both in an earlier era in the 19th century and now in the 21st again. And I hope that that's something that I'm going to be able to figure out.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to the panel. And John, I'm going back to Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and going to try to work on the police chief. So I'm Eric Avery. I've worked for 20 years within the medical humanities in Galveston in an Institute for the Medical Humanities, sort of struggling with the hegemony of the word within the humanities. And Dr. Summergaard, the question is really going to come to you because it's about brain. And it's about brain function. And I'm thinking of Bessel van der Kolk say in The Body Keeps the Score, when trauma, a part of the brain goes offline, and when you recover, you have to kind of get into another part of the mind. And your presentation you speak with 2 minds, with your Buddhist and your Zen cone, and then you show this incredible evidence. So my question's going to come around to the relief that your images gave our spirits and that your cone did. It opens another space. So the question is really about how the humanities function to open space in the mind.
Yeah, I'm sure I don't know how to answer that. There are people here who are much more knowledgeable about that than I am. It's really hard to talk about. It's very difficult to talk about brain, mind, and things like stigma. I'll tell a story, and that may be helpful as a way of understanding it. We talk about stigma as a socially constructed phenomena. Now, I'm old enough to remember the HIV crisis and my colleagues who were, dealing with that, and my friends who were gay, who were would talk about what used to be called internalized homophobia. You know, overcoming a sense of self-criticism or self-blame is really, really hard. Now, some of those things come from the outside, but some of those come from other places as well, particularly around mental disorders, because all of us grow up, and I think this is probably true in most cultures, with a sense that we should be in control of ourselves. You know, we blame ourselves when we're not in control. People will be critical of themselves in a whole host of ways. And on the one hand, while it's, you know, it's true that the genetics and the epidemiology and the neuroimaging all points to certain directions about certain types of mental disorders, or, you know, certainly the impact of substances on people's brains. At the same time, when you talk with people about how they feel about that, it often makes people feel blamed, even though it's theoretically constructed as something to not blame them. I think, you know, so for example, there's a really, really famous woman constitutional lawyer at USC named Ellen Sachs, who has schizophrenia. That's not my diagnosis, that's her stating that about herself. She was valedictorian at Vanderbilt, she went to Oxford, studied in the UK, became psychotic, was in and out of hospitals, and got fantastic both psychopharmacologic and psychotherapeutic care through the National Health Service. Eventually ended up at Yale, where she was in and out of hospitals, and graduated from Yale and became a constitutional law professor, but was in and out of hospitals and was psychotic. After about 10 years of illness, she finally got put on a drug called clozapine, which is a particularly unique antipsychotic and has some very, very distinctive efficacy for people who live with schizophrenia and certain other disorders. And she said at the time when she started to get well, that it was only when she finally accepted the fact that she had a mental disorder that she realized that it wasn't about her, that it didn't define who she was. So people struggle a lot. People, you know, you put a lot of, you know, nobody guards the garbage dump. We guard things that we think are valuable. We guard our sense of self. And so to the extent that people can find a sense of self, or a sense of redemptive self, or a sense of transformative self in the humanities, or they can identify with other people who've gone through similar struggles and they can see a way forward out of what seem like impossible circumstances, then I think that that's an incalculable gift that, you know, stories and humanities can provide for people. But these are very complex internal experiences for people, and they are hard to define from the outside. And nor should we should always be careful, while we can describe certain phenomena and they're useful from a scientific standpoint, from an internal standpoint, we need to be very, very respectful of people's experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Norman Janis. With a rather complicated background, which I not think is relevant, but I'll just want to ask some questions. I've been enjoying this. It's very rich, what the materials that are being presented. What I wanted to ask about is whether we could be a little clearer or about the use of the word narrative or story across the board here. It comes up a little bit, mostly from the literature professors on the left there. I hear there are various ways that what we've been hearing could be presented as stories. There's stories of, Paul has just been using the word stories, and that's great. I mean, stories of despair. A lot of the literary stories are a lot about despair, I mean, especially but you know, both of the things that Susan was talking about. But then there's stories of greed. There's a lot of greed in here, and the stories of, especially from John, about, you know, about some impulses in human beings to try to make things better. And I don't know exactly what I'm asking for, but I sort of would like to hear some kind of coordination of what the whole story is. Yeah, so that's...
Ben, you want to?
Just let me give it a stab, and let me reference Paul's fantastic borrowing from Buddhist parable. My favorite Buddhist parable always was that of the poisoned arrow. And David might be able to tell us where it comes from exactly, but the man who's been shot by the arrow, and he says, "Well, who shot it?" And the guy says, "Well, you should probably get it out, and then we can worry about it." He says, "Who shot it?" And he bleeds out. Like, it's this question of how much does it matter if we know what caused it. I'm a historian, so I think about historical narrative, which I think intersects with the way that literature and English might think about narrative, and certainly was influenced by. But as I think about narrative, I try to understand, well, what are the longer historical stories that we tell about a crisis, and what do they do? And I think about, we often talk about, or we've come to talk about the opioid crisis as the new HIV, the new AIDS crisis. And in that, we have a lot of different competing models of narrative. So I think of one of the earliest narratives of the AIDS crisis was Randy Schiltz's and the Band Played On, which is a really sensitive, moving account of the AIDS crisis as it began to unfurl in the early 1980s. And it talks about different communities in New York and San Francisco who are hit by it, and they try to negotiate it while the CDC struggles to make sense of what's occurring. It's a wonderful piece of journalism. Randy Schiltz died of AIDS right after it was completed, but that's a kind of canonical take. Now that was done, I think, around 1987. In the last couple of years, we had a new book, Jacques Pepin, not the chef, but the microbiologist, who did something called The Origins of AIDS, where he takes a very different narrative account, and he looks at the microbiology of HIV as it shifts and it moves, and he puts together the evidence, and he tells a story that takes place somewhere in Congo, and it takes place somewhere in Haiti, and it takes place in the United States, and it shifts different changing political economies globally and how they start to intersect with each other. Now, neither of these narratives are wrong. One doesn't displace the other. One is a deeply human journalistic account of what a crisis means, what it feels like as it unfurls. It's true, or at least it has truth to it. And I think so does Jacques Pepin's account of the origins of that particular crisis. But maybe what all of us are trying to do in different ways implicitly beneath the surface is to ask, well, what stories matter? And if we're, as we have the work of practitioners who are working on the crisis, what are the stories that we tell? And I think that some stories, stories also have shelf lives. We're living in peak opioid narrative right now. There's a lot that's in the public eye. Some of it is wonderful, some of it's not very good. I saw something, we've had, Susan mentioned books like Dope Sick, or why am I not thinking of the other big? Hillbilly Elegy, these larger narratives with opioids at the core. I saw something in the New York Times the other day, it was a novel described as the first great novel of the opioid crisis. But I think that these also have, while they're important for us and they speak to a broad public, they also have shelf lives. I think the AIDS quilt was part of a great narrative of that crisis. I can't remember the last time I've seen the AIDS quilt. And I wonder whether at some point we'll need to figure out what we're doing with these journalistic accounts, with these historical accounts, if we're going to apply them meaningfully to this crisis and treatment thereof.
Thank you.
And I'll just say something really quickly, which is that, I am making a case for great narratives about addiction. And, I invoke the term epic and, democratic epics. And I'm thinking, very deliberately here about what I consider a new tradition of major works, and it includes TV serials, and it includes some films, which I didn't talk about, and also novelistic works, and I believe that these works have tremendous claim on all the people, who are, functioning, on the front lines of the crisis. I mean, if the only thing that happened, as a result of anyone hearing my paper is they went out and read David Foster Wallace, I would be very happy. I think everyone should be reading that novel who thinks they care about the opioid crisis. It's very long, but I have a way of reading it if you want to ask me later. But I do think this is a great tradition, and it's an important tradition, and it matters, you know, in the terms that, that Ben is laying out here. And I would make an absolute distinction between these more journalistic or more generically conventional works and the works, you know, that I highlighted, which I see as just so profound in their sort of apprehension of the comprehensiveness of the problem. And, you know, their sociological dimensions, their psychological, I think these are exceptional works that demand our attention. So.
It's a great question, and I think the setup of this panel has been great in that, you know, we have the historical perspective, you know, the very current pop culture perspective, the medical perspective, and I come from it, you know, from an activist perspective, and I'm, you know, struck by what Paul said with respect to this is not sustainable. We have reached a tipping point in many ways on many issues as a result of lack of empathy and compassion, and now, you know, at the very highest levels of government, you know, we see the very worst behavior being condoned. I think as human beings, I mean, we have a high level of expectation for ourselves, but we're animals. And we've always medicated in one fashion or another. So it's really, we've reached this tipping point because of the lethality of the weapons, you know, the of the sort of distancing, and, you know, in some ways our ability to adapt are more dangerous than the military-style assault weapons being used in, you know, in schools now. So it's a harm reduction. You know, I think the best we can do is on the harm reduction side. No other country has the issue of daily gun violence like we have. No other country has the issue of abuse of pharmaceutical drugs and the opioid crisis. We're 5% of the world population consuming 80% of the opioids prescribed. This is a manufactured crisis, largely due to bad public policy and greed and special interest politics, because we're not participating in our democracy. We are not holding our elected officials accountable, and there are consequences. And we're a people of, you know, we're a country of people and laws. And if you deregulate healthcare, if you deregulate the gun industry, if you deregulate, you know, the financial industry, people will die, people will go broke, you know, and no surprise, because we are so consumed, you know, in our own self-pleasure and our own consumerism, you know, and here's where, you know, the first thing you ought to do is kill your TV. But, you know, and pay attention to something other than your phone, especially with your kids around and your friends around. But, you know, we're going down the wrong path. And, you know, these are symptoms. The pharmaceutical industry, the gun industry, you know, the White House, the Congress, it's symptoms of really, you know, our not participating in a hard-fought democracy that a lot of people have died for.
Thank you, John.
Hi, I'm Andy from Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. This is a two-part question. The first part is, years ago when I was using, I had to go in bad neighborhoods even to get the drugs and everything else. Now do you see it since the OxyContin came on board? Did you see a big increase in it then when doctors were over-prescribing? And also, I think the last time I was here, you showed a picture that, that one of the local newspapers had about people going to the methadone clinic before they went into their jobs. So how do we change all that? Because now you can just pick up a phone, phone like you said, and have it delivered to you now. So you don't have to go in those areas. You don't have to be ashamed of being seen in those areas. So how do we change all that now?
So this is again about access, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyone want to?
I want to just say one point on, that's why police who are on the front lines are having to change their thinking from strictly the supply side to the demand side. Because there's always going to be, they arrest one dealer in Arlington, Mass. There's 3 more who are going to
Three
take their
more that's
place.
gonna start.
So it's about really helping people on the demand side and helping them hopefully find other ways to cope. Then
We're,
use-
we're willing to tolerate a lot of suffering when we think it's happening to the other. We incarcerate
person
people.
and
We
not
incarcerate people, particularly black and Hispanic people, at just absolutely astronomical rates. For, as somebody said earlier, the things that now are deregulated and decriminalized. People are still in jail in New York for the Rockefeller drug laws, and when the dominant perspective is, well, it's happening to black or brown people, or it's happening to somebody else's kids. That's one thing. At a certain point, it crosses over, and it comes into what's considered, quote unquote, the dominant or the,
Normal area.
either economically dominant or dominant racial. It begins to change that. That's not a good way for us to respond to this, but it is part of our style and our history. And so I think that it makes it much more difficult. There's a supply and demand at not just the international level, but at the local level. And I go back to the, we're willing around a lot of economic power, political power, and other elements to tolerate a lot of bad things for the sake of quote unquote winning or dominating. And that will work until it doesn't work anymore. And when it doesn't work, it will be a painful. That's going to be a very different kind of withdrawal and a very painful one.
Do you
Okay.
think it's also that because of, I read an article, now they say almost everybody knows somebody that has a substance use problem now, or 1 in 10 people know another person that has it. Do you think it's because it's hitting my neighbor or a person I know's person? Do you think that's helping it or hurting it?
Could I take a
Please.
Just do a quick one. We got one more question.
The quickest stab is that, John, you mentioned that, you've been on this theme that we're in a crisis of capitalism. And maybe it's that, maybe it's crisis of democracy. The two are interlinked. And I think this goes back to your question, kind of your thought about empathy. Adam Smith is famous for, he's the guy who puts together capitalism as an idea. He's writing it down. He's also a guy who writes about ethics and the question of nearness and whether things that are painful near to you or far from you, how they impact you. So in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he writes it before he writes Capital. He says, let's say I hear about an earthquake and it's in China, again China, and a couple thousand people die and I read about it in my morning paper. He goes, I don't have any pain from that. He goes, it doesn't bother me. It's far away. He goes, but if I hear about a guy who's down the block and I know him and he breaks his leg, I think of this as unbelievable tragedy. And he's writing as an ethical thinker. This is 200 years ago. He's putting this together or more. And he's putting these ideas together of how important is it for you to see suffering near you? What does it mean when it's close to you? So I think that it's, there's nothing good about the prevalence of suffering and how close we see it. But I think that if there's any silver lining in it, it's that knowing, and you've seen this in your work, knowing that people who we love and are in our communities suffer is deeply powerful, and that's the thin edge of the wedge that we can use to make good policy decisions. I hope it is.
Thank you, Ben. David, could you
Do you want to pose
shout?
a question?
Just shout. Okay.
My name is David Eckel. I'm a member of the religion department here at Boston University, and I'm a member also of the executive committee of the Humanities Center. And I have a certain kind of interest in Buddhism, so Dr. Summergrad, I wanted to thank you so much for giving us such a charming image of that Chinese Buddha and mentioning the Brahmaviharas, which, quite apart from the opioid crisis, I find an extremely useful meditative device when you're driving in Boston. We should all take instruction from what you've offered us. You know, it's 2 minutes after the end of our session, and I've never really liked the people who stand up and ask a big, open-ended, fuzzy question when everyone wants to go home. So I will ask an open-ended and fuzzy question, and you should feel free to say nothing about it at all, which may be actually the point of your koan. The question is there a religious dimension to what you've been talking about, to this narrative that we've been constructing for ourselves this afternoon and constructed so brilliantly yesterday? I think that the quality of the discussion here across the board has really been, I would say, extremely impressive and speaks so well to you as participants and to Susan, your organization. But the voice that you've given us, Dr. Summergrad, about Buddhism might well be picked up and pursued in other religious traditions too in American culture. And I just wonder if in your experience or if in your thinking about the opioid crisis, whether there's a religious dimension that we ought to address.
Yeah, I think there's a profound religious dimension. You know, obviously there's a strong, particularly Judeo-Christian redemptive tradition in American, both public life and American culture, but that's not obviously the only one. I think that, you know, when people lose a sense of purpose and meaning, and I think, you know, religion at its highest can bring a sense of both purpose and meaning, it becomes hard to tolerate pain. You know, it becomes hard to tolerate where one is or isn't compared to where one expected to be. So I do think there's a deep dimension to that, and I think it's really important, just if you look at the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, Bill W., leaving aside the fact that some of this may have been pharmacologically induced, you know, had a pretty profound religious experience, and, you know, which led to the, you know, the way in which he developed And that's not to say Alcoholics Anonymous is a cure-all, end-all, be-all, but there's certainly an element of religious transformation in all of this. But I think for the country, we need a sense of, or for our, you know, the people who are suffering, need a sense of what is going to give them the capacity to tolerate pain and suffering in their own lives, and a sense of purposefulness and direction, and some of that can come from religious experience.
Let me just say quickly, you know, one sentence, which is I think religion is, you know, sort of profoundly evident in the two works I talked about in terms of its absence. I mean, I think what's so striking about Wallace's work and also Breaking Bad is that, you know, very atypically for an American sort of cultural tradition, religion isn't there, you know, in any really substantial way. So I think, you know, it means a lot. I mean, I think your question is really, really central.
Yeah, I think that's true, Susan. I'm struck by the absence of religion in so much of the discussion, and I wonder whether that's actually a very telling outcome of the conference.
No, I think it is. I mean, you have to think about Durkheim here, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm fascinated by that question. I mean, my religion is nature, and I'm fascinated. You know, I hadn't really thought of it the way you were thinking of it, other than, you know, addiction is often kind of referred to as a disease of isolation. And, you know, Karl Marx said, you know, religion is the opiate of the people, which is pretty fascinating in and of itself in this context. But it's sort of like, you know, if you've got the disease of isolation, you know, it's sort of a symptom of the death of religion for a lot of people, or belonging.
So I think we should probably close now. And let me just, you know, one last time, just express my really profound gratitude to Tamsin Sanders, who has just been absolutely amazing.
And could we also thank our panelists?
Yes, let's thank our panelists, not me, everyone else.
Yeah, you too.